Next big show, and a really wonderful show, is the Haydes Hall production of Split Second for ABC. This is 1972. And here is one of the shows, sort of a general knowledge quiz show with a twist. That one of the shows that really exemplifies or demonstrates your great skill as a broadcaster. How quickly and masterfully you go through this material. Talk to us about Split Second. How did it come about? And again, it's a Monty Hall production, but he didn't host it. They chose to have you host it.
Well, he was busy doing a thing called Let's Make a Deal, you know. So why did they choose me? I don't know. You have to ask him and Steph Haydes.
Well, give us a sense of how'd you first get involved with it? What do you recall about that?
I don't remember. They just came to my guy, my agent or manager, and said they have this show. It's a quiz. They want to talk to you about it. And they set up a meeting with a fellow by the name of Stu Billett. And I had never met him. He's from New York. And we sat down somewhere in one of the Haydes Hall offices. And Stu explained the show to me and asked if I would be interested in it. And I said, I'm always interested in a good, well-run show. So, yes, I'm interested. Look, we can talk. And so they started doing run-throughs so you could get the feel of it. As I recall, I can't remember all the run-throughs. But it was a terrific show. And it was one unlike any other show I'd ever done. It was every bit as tough, if not tougher than Jeopardy, believe it or not, because of its title, Split Second. It was called Split Second for a reason. You not only had to have an answer, but you had to have it within 3 seconds. Boom. Each question had 3 different answers to it. And if the guy on your right gave one answer, you had to think of another answer in addition to that. So anyway, you had to sift through a lot, as a contestant, you had to sift through a lot of knowledge quickly in order to stay in that game. And so it was a double whammy, and it was very good. And the pace was maddening almost. But I got into it, and sorry to say I did quite well, but I did it pretty well. It was not an easy show. You had to not only do the show, you had to be as quick as the material was. You had to just really, when you gave an answer, when you gave, like, you have $5 and next for $2, you feel like an auctioneer. Boom, you went right immediately to the next thing. But of course, I have to tell you that all of that only works when you have a staff that was as well oiled as that one was. Beginning with the writing was superior. The staff was superior. When they put their headsets on and sat at the table and that show went into gear, everybody was listening to every word and every syllable that was being said, and decisions had to be made instantly on behalf of the writers and the producers at the table, in the audience, in the table, at the producer's table, as well as in the booth, as well as here. So it was well done. It was well run, and yet we managed. At one point we could only do 3 of them a day because they were so intense. But then we ended up doing 5 a day after a while, thanks to tape. But when I came home at night, I was scrambled. My brains were scrambled. I was flat out. But I enjoyed it. It was really a workout.
It's interesting that in the beginning you did not tape 5 in a day, because stripping the shows straight through 5 at a time was such a common practice in those days because of money. The fact that they took the time and the expense to come back a second day is really interesting.
Well, that's what it required. Same thing with tune, which we'll get to. Tune was intense. Some shows, when you say 5 a day, like Pyramid, They do. Clark used to do 10 a day. I mean, as many as you could, because there was not, it was a good show, but it was a simple format and no heavy lifting. But when you get into Split Second and Jeopardy and shows like that require pace, and pace, it's very wearing on everyone involved, and you have to have a well-oiled machine to pull it off, and they do pull it off. So I don't know, I'm being repetitious here, but all I'm saying is some shows are much easier to do 5 a day than others. And Split Second, when we finally got to 5 a day on that, I didn't think I didn't think I'd be able to do it. Also, you have to think about the voice. It can go.
As I said, in watching you do this, you get a sense of craft as a broadcaster and your ability to bring that craft to these questions and this material. It's very hard to do and enunciate clearly and go quickly, and you did that very well. As we said, it's Stephen Hadis and Monty Hall, longtime production team responsible for Let's Make a Deal. What was it like working with them, and what sense did you get of those two men and their different roles in the production of this?
They obviously were a very good combination. They were two different people altogether. I didn't know Steph very well. I knew Monty better than I did Steph. And when I met them, they were both obviously very talented, and their talents blended obviously, because they put together some well-run shows, but when it came to working for them, I never had a problem with anybody. First of all, Monty never came around because it would be obvious that one MC is not a good idea to go and try and tell another MC what to do. And Monty says, "You got it, baby, just go." And Monty gave me only one piece of advice after either our first. We did a couple of pilots. No, we did one pilot, and he came back and we were talking about it. And he said, "I'm very happy." He said, "You might pick up the pace a little bit." And I said, "Okay." And so the next one I went on, I picked up the pace a little bit, and after that he said, "That's it, you got it." And so that was the only thing he said. And from then on, I never saw him. He never came around. Steph Hadis was never in the studio. He might have been behind the curtain, I don't know. But I never had any problems with anybody. They hired competent people for producing and directing, and they let them do it. That's a good organization.
Any thoughts on Hadis Hall or any questions on Hadis Hall?
Who did produce?
Bob Sines.
Next, in your Split Second in 1972 to 1975, 850 episodes, as far as we know. And your next game in that same year, in fact, it comes along a month later for ABC, is a revival of You Don't Say. Again, John Harlan is the announcer.
Oh, yeah.
Here's the first time for you that because later you would revisit Name That Tune. The first time for you that you revisit a show you had done before. What were your thoughts on coming back to picking up a new version of You Don't Say?
The new version, and they changed the format somewhat. They put four celebrities up there and 2 contestants over here, as opposed to 2 and 2. Anyway, it was a different format. And it was okay. I don't think it was as good as the original, but that was just me. I thought, well, I'm too attached to the original, so maybe I'm not a good person to judge, but it was okay, the revisit. It was doing all right. The only reason it went off is because there was a vice president over there who wanted to make some changes, and we just happened to be the new kid on the block, so they dropped us. In other words, the show wasn't the recreation of the show was still okay. There was nothing wrong with it. It just didn't sizzle.
Concurrent to your work on Split Second and You Don't Say, you began hosting, and again, here is another example of you coming onto a show that was a long-standing show from going back even to radio, and that's Name That Tune. And you first came on to host the nighttime syndicated version only, and later you did the other versions.
Yeah, go ahead.
if that's correct. If it's not correct, please tell me. But beginning 1974, your first hosting gig, and you would host it again a couple of other times, of Name That Tune.
Yeah.
So talk to us about the beginnings of Name That Tune for you.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, it was really only one show, and that was the nighttime syndicated show from 74 to 81. Now, I did, after it went off the network, out of syndication, I did go over and do a short daytime version on NBC. But that was just kind of a filler. They were just playing around with their day. They were still juggling their daytime schedule, and they just put it in there. It really, Name That Tune does not lend itself to stripping. By that I mean doing 5 a week is a bit much. It's better off, and it breathes better when it's 1 a week. That's my opinion, but I think that it's backed up by its history. And what was the other question? So anyway, how did I come by Name That Tune? I came by Name That Tune when I got a phone call one day, and it was Ralph Edwards. I had worked for him before, but as an announcer, sometimes once a host on one of his shows, About Faces with Ben Alexander. And so I knew Ralph, but I didn't know him well, and he knew me, but he knew me mostly as an announcer. Wasn't that sure that I was really cut out to be an MC. But by the time Name That Tune came along, Ralph and his people had gone through, evidently, I don't know, they had gone through a number of possibilities for hosts or hostesses for that show, and finally decided to go for me. And Ralph called me. Would you like to come in and talk? I said, I'll come and talk to you about anything, anytime, anywhere. Of course, Mr. Edwards, it'd be my pleasure. I went in, and he told me about the show. Of course, I knew the show. I used to watch it with Bill Cullen and a guy whose name big hit, singer type guy. Anyway, it's
Bird Parks.
No, I'll think of it later. Anyway, in other words, I was a fan of the show. I knew about Name That Tune. Great show, loved it. But I was interested in knowing what Ralph was going to do with it. So I'm thinking about putting this show. It was a franchise that he was bringing into his fold. Ralph Edwards, up until that point, well, mostly created his own stuff. Most of his stuff were his own creations out of his stable. But this is one that was an established show that they wanted to bring back. So what are you going to do with it? So he started describing to me, and I'll never forget it. He had one. He said, "There's one thing we're going to do. I think we're going to maybe add a little excitement to it. We're going to have people who work their way up a ladder, and then when they win the name of the ultimate song, they come down a slide." Oh no, that's it. He said instead of running to ring a bell, they go up a ladder, come down a slide. They slide down a slide and ring a bell. And I sat there and I listened to him. I said, "Well, that's interesting. You guys may have something there. I don't know." He said, "Well, what do you think about it?" I said, "Well, I don't." He said, "Well, come on. What do you think about it?" I said, "I think it's a game show that requires two people naming tunes." I said, "I can't see ringing a bell." I said, "The business of running back and forth to ring a bell means you have to be ambulatory. You can't use someone who is not ambulatory. It requires someone of the same age group. What do you got them in sneakers," and they did put them in sneakers when they did it in New York. And I said, and as for the coming down the slide, I said, to me, they're all distractions from what I think is a good game show. And he says, oh, yeah, good. He said, "Well, thank you very much, Tom. I sure appreciate it." I said, "Well, you're welcome. It was a pleasure talking to you." And they obviously had a few meetings. And then he called my agent and says, "We want to use Tom, but we want to talk to him about, we're going to change the format a bit from what I told him. And so let's enter into serious negotiations," which they did. And then they started talking about all the nuts and bolts. And they brought me in and did scaled down version. They kept a couple of little things, like they had a thing called a money tree, where a tree went around with dollars in it. They had another one where there were some magnetic things on a board, and they had, I think that was named that tune. And they had other little things in rounds, but basically it was two people standing, not with, you don't have to run, you don't have to skip, you don't have to jump. You just stand in front of a thing and you hit a buzzer when you think you know the tune. And that was basic. In other words, they brought it down to where it was, and it worked. And I said, I like it. And they said, and so we made a deal. That's it. And it ran for 7 years. They made a few changes. They got rid of the money tree. They got rid of the blackboard. I forget what they called it. And it got down to just, the only thing they did was they spun a wheel. They did spin a wheel for one of the rounds. But the wheel we knew was going to be a hit, because that's one of the biggest attractions on Price is Right, believe it or not. People love to see a spinning wheel.
Melody Roulette on the
Melody Roulette.
But
it was very good. I thought they devised it, made it cogent. It had something. It meant something. It wasn't. They didn't just spin the wheel because you determine two things. You determine the amount of money and also what tune it might be. So anyway, it worked.
Again, talking about some of the notable producers for whom you worked and notable personalities with whom you worked, Ralph Edwards from Truth or Consequences, Aren't We Devils, all those things. Yeah. And again, another longtime Pioneer Broadcasters member, I think another founding member. What was it like working for Ralph Edwards?
Heaven. One of the most knowledgeable and one of the most gracious human beings on earth. Just wonderful to work with. Everything, he was a performer, so he knew what a performer's lot was. He knew how to treat his performers. He listened to them, he worked with them, and he was very malleable. He also had a great staff. People who worked for Ralph Edwards when you got a job with him, you had a job for life. That was Ralph Edwards. You got on his staff, you were there till they brought you out feet first. He was just terrific. I enjoyed it, and I was very privileged to be able to work for that man.
There are a number of notable personalities associated with Name That Tune over the years, and with your version, you worked on the version of Name That Tune that had singers, because there were some versions that did not have singers. Mm-hmm. And one of the most notable, I guess the most famous singer to come out of that series is Kathie Lee Gifford. Mm-hmm. What are your memories of Kathie Lee Gifford?
When she came on my show, she was Kathie Lee Johnson. I thought she was terrific. She just delivered everything that everyone hoped she would. She was beautiful. She sang beautifully. She was terrific. She was a great addition to the show, and I think really was a great asset on that show. I enjoyed it very much. And we got along great. I got along with everyone on that show. Incidentally, the announcer on that show was the same announcer and associate producer that I had worked with on any number of shows, and that's the one and only John Harlan, the best.
So Harlan also had an associate producer's credit in addition to...
Yeah, on a number of shows, yeah. He did. He wore a couple of hats with the Andrews Yeagerman outfit.
So what was, in your memory, as associate producer, what were his responsibilities with the show?
Oh, he just, in general, he sat in all our meetings and made sure that everybody on staff knew their jobs. He was just an all-around associate producer, is about the best way to put it. But his main thing was, of course, being in that studio and backing me up, which he did as only John Harlan could do, you know. John Harlan is one of those guys with that beautiful voice, God. John and I go back to when we were announcers, and we were both auditioning for KNX Radio. And we both talked about it. And, of course, we were in competition with each other. And make a long story short, there was only one opening, he got it. John was the best. He was mellifluous. He was a beautiful voice, great personality, worked with the audience, worked with his co-host or his colleague, me, and we were a great team.
Well, as I expressed earlier, Harlan, a uniquely skillful announcer in his ability to bring, I think, various types of reads, from the big, bombastic read to a more quiet, friendly, warm tone. You worked with him more than any other announcer, if I go through your credits here.
Yeah, I think so.
Is that just coincidence, or did you specifically...
I think it was coincidence. Of course, whenever... it was coincidence because we worked for different organizations. We worked for Andrew Jageman, and we worked for Ralph Edwards, and that's about it, come to think of it. Those were the two organizations, but we were a pair that worked, and so they automatically put us together, I guess. I don't know. I don't know. It just happened that way, and I couldn't be happier.
Do you have notes or questions? Yes, thank you very much, Randy. Randy West here with a note and a good reminder to ask you about another important figure who relates to Name That Tune, and that's Sandy Frank.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on
a little
her
comic
memories
relief there?
Memories of Sandy Frank?
I never knew him too well. He came in as Ralph Edwards Productions produced that Name That Tune, but Ralph and Sandy, Ralph brought Sandy in as I guess you would call him a co-executive producer. I guess that's what they called him. And because he co-executive produced, Ralph was on top. But he worked with Randy for some reason. He brought him into the organization. I don't know why, but he did. And Sandy Frank, I hardly ever saw him. He was part of the organization, but I didn't deal with him, nor he with I. No, they didn't want too many people coming to me,
Sure.
And so Ralph Edwards is first of all, Ralph Edwards himself could come up on stage and talk to me anytime he, interrupt anything. He never did. He would just simply pick up the phone and say to Dick Gottlieb or to Ray Horrell, who was the producer, say, talk to Tom about this, see what he thinks about this, or suggest this to Tom. And then Ray would come up and make a suggestion. So what I'm saying is there was a pipeline. And I always was connected with Ralph Edwards, but I didn't have a pipeline with Sandy Frank because I didn't need one.
Earlier in the conversation, I mentioned Randy West being here, who's a noted game show authority also, and who's helped with some of the research on this. And Randy also mentioned Ray Horrell, and you mentioned his name there. Yeah. Give us a sense of him and his involvement.
Oh, God. Ray loved Name That Tune. Oh, my gosh. With a passion. And he was so excited to be part of it. And he also was so passionate in his work that when they decided to do It's Your Bet, which has been mentioned off and on, because It's Your Bet is one of those little shows that it's a cute little thing that keeps popping up from time to time. And when it popped back up in San Diego, they hired Ray to do that too. Ray was very enthusiastic, completely dedicated to the show, and we got along famously. He was just great. I had no problems whatsoever with anyone in the Edwards organization. That includes Ray Horrell, Dick Gottlieb, John Harlan, and anyone else.
Another name that you mentioned just a moment ago as a former host of Name That Tune, he doesn't relate to your time as host of that show, but we've got to ask about him sometime, and we haven't yet, and that's Bill Cullen, who was one of the early hosts of Name That Tune and was a extended member of your family at one point. Just, again, it's out of order, no particular sequence, but give us your thoughts on Bill Cullen and your relationship with him.
Like the rest of America, I was a fan of Bill Cullen from day one, actually the late 30s and 40s when Cullen was big in radio. And when I say big, and in New York, he did everything. He did network shows, he did local shows. He would go back and forth from studio to studio, office to office, all day long, morning, noon, and night. He was phenomenal. He was a kind of a average Joe to look at, to meet. You think he's just an average Joe, but he's far from average. Very intelligent. Read every newspaper extant, every magazine there was. So in other words, he was at all times completely informed. That's why they used him so much on the panel shows. The guy was with it. He was with it. He had it. He did everything, radio and television. Now, Bill Cullen ran into a fellow by the name of Jack Nars, who was my brother, in New York. And Jack was doing fairly well. As a matter of fact, in the early stages of Price is Right, when Bill wanted to take a day off or sneezed or something, they would bring Jack in to do the show, Price is Right. And Jack did very well. And so Jack and Bill became good friends. Well, later on, they became friends in a number of ways. My brother married Mary Lou Rameheld, had 4 children, and Mary Lou Rameheld's sister, Jack and Bill, all right, let's see how we can do this. There was a show once that Ralph Edwards was producing called Place the Face, and they brought Bill Cullen from New York to do the show. And they also asked Jack, my brother, if he would announce the show and do the commercials, because the commercial was also, the sponsor was in love with my brother, some shampoo or something that Jack had a relationship with. So they brought Bill Cullen out to do the show, and my brother was the announcer. And so one day after one of their tapings, my brother brought Bill Cullen out to his home for a pool party. And at that pool party, Bill Cullen looked across the pool and said, "Who is that beautiful girl over there with that old man?" He said, "First of all, that old man is Heinz Rameheld. He's my father-in-law. He's a famous composer and conductor." And he says, "And that woman is my wife's sister." And he says, "Really?" And so Jack said, "Well, I'll introduce you." And he took Bill Cullen over and introduced him to Anne McCumber. Fade out, fade in. 6 months later, or 8 months later, they were Mr. and Mrs. Bill Cullen. Bill fell head over heels for she for he. They got married. They lived in New York, and it was a wonderful marriage. So that made Jack Nars and Bill Cullen brothers-in-law through marriage, right? Okay. So Jack's my brother. So I used to say, Bill Cullen is Gary Moore. One day I was a guest on Secret, I guess it was. I've got a secret to tell the truth. To tell the truth. And Gary, they wrote it out for Gary. Gary Moore says, "I got to tell you something about Tom Kennedy." He says his real name is Jim Norris. He's the brother of a guy who is the brother-in-law who has a wife who is the sister-in-law of, he said, "Forget about it. They know each other." And that's it. And everybody fell down. Everybody tried to explain the relationship between me and Bill Cullen, but it was through my brother and his wife and sister-in-law. And that's pretty confusing, isn't it?
As you've noted, Cullen spent most of his career in New York, and he would fly out here to work, but
Yeah.
he didn't live out here until much later. So because you were based out here, did you have a lot of contact with him during those years when you were family?
No, not really. Once in a while. Namely through Jack. Jack and Mary Lou used to throw parties, and Bill was always there when he was on the West Coast. Bill only spent 2 or 3 days here. And if he had any extra days, he and Ann would go down to the desert. He loved the desert. So I didn't get to see him too much. I ran into Bill most often either in the studio, either in New York or on the West Coast. And then, well, later on in life, I did get to know him a little bit better. But I didn't. When he was busy, and so was I. So didn't see him that much. But we hit it off great. We were good friends.
We've talked a little bit about the idea of the craft of broadcasting in this conversation. When you talk to game show MCs, Cullen is the name who always
Then
comes
that's
up as the man who was most admired for his ability, his mastery of the craft. You talked a little bit about his everyman quality, which he had, but underneath that lies a great skill as a broadcaster. As a great broadcaster yourself who did the same kind of work, what can you say about Cullen's skill as a broadcaster?
he was the best. That's all. I can't think of anyone who was any better than he. There were a lot of great MCs: Bud Collyer, Gary Moore, Merv Griffin. I mean, these guys were all doing. These were mostly the guys doing shows out of New York. Gene Rayburn, Monty Hall, Peter Marshall. You could name them all. Bill was the best. That's all there is to it. And it was unpretentious, no big deal. He didn't come. He didn't do anything silly or crazy. He just simply was himself, and he was like the young man that we discussed off camera a while ago, a fellow by the name of Vin Scully, who had the admiration of everyone he ever worked for and anyone he ever knew. And when you talk about people like Vin Scully, who was around for years, and Bill Cullen, you're simply talking about the best. That's all there is to it. You don't have to go any further than that.
That's lovely. Continuing with your shows, concurrent to Name That Tune, because it ran for so many years in nighttime syndication, you were doing a lot of other shows in those years. And the next one that came along, we were talking about game show producers for whom you worked, and you worked for most of the very notable ones at one point or another. 1976, for Barry and Enright, the show is Break the Bank.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is, I think, your first association with Barry Enright.
It was, yeah.
What are your thoughts on Break the Bank and your thoughts on working for this famous and maybe even somewhat infamous production company?
Well, they were infamous, the Barry and Enright. They overcame and outlived that infamy, and both went on to reconstitute their careers, each of them. It was a good show. 4 celebrities going vertically and 5 going horizontally. They had 9 celebrities, and what they were doing, and it was a cute show. It worked. It was kind of complicated, but what they were doing was come as close as they could to another hit called Hollywood Squares, where they had 9 people up there in a grid, and so they commissioned, or somebody came up with this idea for this quiz that with these boxes that turn around upon command, and their boxes are controlled by these answers from these celebrities. So in other words, it was a Hollywood Squares meets concentration kind of thing. That's what it was. It was Hollywood Squares meets concentration. I hadn't thought of that before. That's pretty good. That's what it was. I hadn't thought of that before, but that's what it was. And it was all right. It lasted for a little while, and I got along okay.
Cashing in on the popularity of the celebrity panel shows in Hollywood Squares, it's a combination of a number of things. Runs, according to the notes, April to July of 1976. Again, Barry and Enright, they had worked together going back to 21 and worked together later on a lot of shows. What were those two men like, and what was their individual involvement in working with you? Were they very hands-on?
Enright, yes. Barry, once again, Jack knew better than to try to. He was an MC, right? I mean, he was a producer, but he was also an MC. I was an MC. So as I said before with Monty Hall and Split Second, Jack Barry knew it wouldn't be a good idea for him to come up and try to tell the host what to do or how to do it, because that's what he did. And so Jack Barry left me alone, hands off. He would just say, "Hey, how you doing?" And fine. Dan Enright was more hands-on. Dan was the guy who worked. He was the mechanic. He worked with the contestants as well as me. And as far as I'm concerned, he left me alone. Pretty much, I did what I wanted to do. He, of course, would. Dan Enright was one who had a good feel for pace, and if he ever felt I was slacking off a little bit, he would give me a little speed up, and that would be it. And he would be right. So in other words, we had a very good working relationship. I had no problems with him. I hear from other people that he had problems with some of the people that he worked with, but I never had any.
And some game MCs who worked for the company did say that Jack Barry could be a little too hands-on in giving tips, but in your case, they respected your work and left you alone.
I don't know what his relationship was with other people and under others. I just don't know.
Sure.
But with me, no problem.
It is during this period of time there's a succession of several shows that have brief runs. That's the first. The second, for NBC, Ralph Andrews' production, John Harlan announcing again, is a very unusual show called 50 Grand Slam.
Oh, Lord, yeah.
It seems to be part $64,000 question. It has a progressive jackpot. It has specificity of... the contestants are quizzed based on an area of interest that they have or area of knowledge. Talk to us about 50 Grand Slam, a short run and a kind of an unusual show.
It was an unusual show. Basically, it was a show that was based upon skills of the contestants. When I say the contestants, whoever was going to be on the show. And that would be skills either in music, in sports, in any walk of life you can think of. They brought in people who were skilled, and the people competed against each other. Had a huge, magnificent, very big, very luxurious, almost cumbersome set that went around like huge dice going around. So in other words, they went big for showcasing. Had a lot of lights and music. And the skilled people that they brought in were very good, except for one particular couple they brought in, and it was in music. And I dropped the ball there. Not dropped the ball, but I let one get past me. There was a question concerning who wrote a song, whether it was Irving Berlin or Cole Porter from Silk Stockings. And the contestant, there were two skilled contestants. This guy over here was a Los Angeles Times theater critic, and this man over here was a New York musicologist and music theater guru who has written books about it. And they both gave me the correct answer, and I said to both of them, I said, "You're wrong." They both said Cole Porter. I said, "No, it was Irving Berlin," or vice versa. And they both looked at me. They receive instructions. Don't argue with the MC on the air. Wait till we go to commercial, and if you have any grievances, listen, we'll work it out. So we went to commercial, and I knew something was wrong, and I said, "Wait a minute, I'm talking to myself now." I said to both of them, "You were wrong," and we went on with the show. But the staff came up on stage during commercial break and said, "We were wrong. It was Cole Porter. It was not Irving Berlin." I even to this day, I can't remember which was which. It doesn't matter. It's just that we had it wrong, and I should have known better. So they had to call New York and see what to do, because standards and practices wanted to treat it properly and make sure that neither of the contestants were slighted in any way. So anyway, that was a good capital D debacle, a flat-out debacle. Came back on the air. I tried to explain in as few words as possible that we had goofed. It was not going to be counted against this person. It was not going to be counted against that person. We're going to go back to square one and do it all over again. And we did, and we went on. Of course, the Mr. and Mrs. America didn't see most of that, but the show was wounded. And we were sort of the laughing stock that we let that thing go through the way it did. But it was all right. It was a good show. It was just big and busy, and I guess, I don't know, disjointed perhaps is a good word, and it didn't work. So once again, you win some and you lose some.
Interesting that this is a show that attempted at least to give away $50,000 in daytime.
That was another one of their hooks, yeah. Lights, music, and music. You know, when you're putting together a show, there's such a thing as entertainment. You know, is it entertaining? Yes. Okay. Well, and if it's not entertaining, throw some more lights in there. Let's, get some dancing girls or something. And so they resort to money, 100,000, 200, 5 million, whatever. Just throw some more money at it, throw some more lights on there, get some dancing girls, and try to goose this thing up. Forget about is this a good show or not. You know, I saw a thing a while ago on To Tell the Truth, a current version. Oh, it was the worst thing I think I've ever seen in my life. It was just garbage. Had nothing to do with the show. They didn't play the game anymore. It was who could say the naughtiest, dumbest, and dirtiest thing they could. And incidentally, there were no holds barred. If you said a word, even today they just bloop it out. But you know at home what the bloop is, you know. And so the game, not often, but sometimes the game is forgotten. And the window dressing is overwhelming. The money and the lights and all that. That's all nice. But if you don't have a game, let's do something else.
And it's worth noting that some of the longest running games, like To Tell the Truth or What's My Line, played for almost no money, very little money.
Precisely because they were a good game. It was the game that counted. The money didn't mean anything. The set didn't mean anything. It was how well it was played and how entertaining. You just said it beautifully.
On the heels of 50 Grand Slam comes, in fact, that show ends December of that year. You come back the very next week and an NBC daytime version of a show you were also hosting in nighttime syndication, Name That Tune. This is the NBC daytime Name That Tune.
There you go.
And again, it's a successful series in syndication, but it doesn't run very long during the day.
Well, a couple of things wrong with it. It doesn't lend itself too much to a daytime period, but it also does not, as I said before, it does not lend itself to stripping. By that I mean 5 a week. It just isn't that kind of a show. And all they were doing at that time, at that point in time, was they were juggling shows. They didn't know what was going to work well, but when 50 Grand Slam went off, I was on the premises anyway, being NBC, and so they said, well, and we got an opening in the daytime. Let's bring Tune over and throw that in there, and they did. They threw it in there, and it didn't work. Well, Dennis James did it over there too for a while. Dennis James did Name That Tune at NBC daytime for a brief while, either before or after me. I don't know. It was all a wash because it was all over. In other words, Name That Tune was a hit when it was nighttime, and that's where it belongs, once a week.
What is it, to make it more clear to those viewing this, so many shows, they worked at night, they worked in 5-day-a-week strip syndication, they worked on the network. What is it about this show that makes you say that it just isn't a show to go every day?
With Name That Tune, is that what you're talking about, Name That Tune?
Yes.
It sort of requires you to anchor yourself and sit there and watch that baby no matter what, because there's a lot going on, and some of it is visual, and some of it, of course, it's basically a musical show, but we had, like you said, a girl singer, and we also had 2 different bands, and we also had dancers, so it was really a production show, right? This is something you want to see on Broadway, and so it's a production show. Well, daytime is not. Production shows don't go too well because daytime requires more of a casual format. So people can go about whatever they're doing, whether it's in the office or in the home. They can sort of half watch a show and enjoy it without watching an extravaganza, so to speak. That's about it. So in other words, some shows are simple and deserve to be played in the parlor. And some are more splendiferous, and they should be played on stage, like a Broadway show.
So to put it in the old sort of anachronistic sense, Tune is not a show that a housewife would listen to while she's ironing.
She could, yeah, she could.
It's a show that needs to be really watched.
You know something? Since it wasn't tried once a week daytime, we'll never know, will we? Because they didn't bother to try it once a week. They just threw it in as a strip. And so they hit a wall. I mean, when I say they hit a wall, they hit a wall of ennui.
You mentioned the fact that you said, since I was already at NBC. You did several shows in a row for NBC in those years. Were you under contract to NBC in those days?
Yeah, I was for a while. I guess during that period. There was a woman whose name? Lynn Boland.
Oh, very,
Was
very
o-
famous and somewhat reviled in some circles.
I don't know. I got along with her fine, but well, I was one of her guys. She had a stable. Me, Chuck Woolery, Alex Trebek were three of her guys. In other words, people that she liked in that genre, and she liked to use us whenever possible. So I did have a contract with NBC for running for a few years. I guess it was during that time or not. Anyway, Lynn, whenever, like when 50 Grand Slam went off, immediately she looked at something else to use me on. She wanted to use me before anybody else did.
So
So I was always, what's next?
So you worked with her well and got along with her well.
We got along fine.
The show that was What's Next, in this case, was another NBC show, to say the least. And this is Name That Tune, daytime Name That Tune, goes off the air in June of 77. And to say the least, goes on the air NBC in October of 77. This is a Heater Quigley show with Kenny Williams announcing, who was the longtime announcer on Hollywood Squares. Yeah. What are your thoughts on, again, another short-run show, to say the least?
It was a good little show. It was one. I'll be honest with you. It was one of those average good shows. You couldn't say it was a hit. You couldn't say it was a miss. It was just somewhere in the middle, and that ain't bad. That's somewhere in the middle. There are some shows that go for decades, just being what they are, And it's not saying anything bad about them, but on the other hand, they're not that sensational. It's just one of those shows. And that was one of those shows that was pretty okay. A graph up there, and they drop words one at a time. I can't remember. To say the least, you bring it down. Okay. The celebrity would go into an isolation booth. They would drop a word, and then the celebrity would come out and try, with the words that are left in that phrase, try to guess what the subject was. And it worked. It was all right. But it was a celebrity show, 4 celebrities, 2 contestants, and a board, and it was okay.
Any thoughts on working with, again, another well-known game show announcer, Kenny Williams?
What about him?
Any thoughts on him or memories of working with him?
Kenny Williams was part of the scenery. Kenny Williams has been around for as long as I remember the voice of Kenny Williams from the time I first was aware of the fact that there were people on the other end of a microphone. He did everything that Heater Quigley ever did. He was always on the air, and he was full of enthusiasm. He did his job, and he did it well, and he was a town crier. And his Tootsie Roll Pops, and here he is, and he had Mike Fields, and he was and he'd go all day and all night. He was always him. And he was great. Everybody loved him. Kenny Williams was just terrific. And he was a good utility man, and he was part of the fabric. He was a great guy. I enjoyed him. I loved all of them. John Harlan, I've already expressed my feelings about him. Johnny Olson, one of the sweetest guys I've ever known. And really one of the most talented. He was really talented. And he and his wife Penny really went back into early radio. Anyway,
with the end of, to say the least, ends your run of shows on NBC. When these various shows came on the air at NBC and didn't run very long, you were in favor at NBC at that time, as you expressed. Did you have any concern that we're doing these various shows and they're not really working? Does that concern you in the career sense of I've been associated with several shows that didn't really work? Or did you just say, well, that's the show they gave me and I won't worry about that and go to the next one?
I don't know. I didn't carry. Whenever a show went down, I didn't go into a grief period for too long a time, because it was part. As I said, it's part of life. Death is part of life, and I was for the most part I was pretty satisfied with the shows that I did because, fortunately, not at the outset, but later in my career, I had the privilege of passing on them, yay or nay. In other words, I had a choice. I didn't always have a choice, you know. It really kills me with some people interviewing these young kids coming in and say, "Why did you do that movie?" And I kept saying, "Well, it was offered to her. That's why she did the movie." And same thing, you know, I did the first ones because they were offered to me. And then later on, I did have somewhat of a voice in what I did. But I never regretted any decisions that I made. I didn't have any second guessings. I considered myself quite fortunate all along the line.
Well, your next show, 1979, this time for CBS, and it got a reasonable run. It got a little over a year's run. And this is, to my looking at the tapes, kind of a quirky show, and it must have been a tough show to host because even the name is a little odd. It's called Phew.
Oh, yeah. I was wondering what you were building. I couldn't think of how. Phew, yeah. Well, that was a very, when it comes to construction, a very well-constructed, tight-knit little show that went so fast they didn't have a chance of succeeding because you couldn't keep up with it. It was good if you could hear everything, but you couldn't react to anything because whatever took place that was kind of funny, you went on to the next thing immediately because you didn't have time to laugh. It was very well constructed. Jay Wolpert, bright guy, well done. I mean, when I say well done, I'm talking about the format, not me. I'm talking about the show. Well conceived. I understood it, but it was too fast for the room.
An unusual show that plays for humor. A general quiz that also plays for humor. It's got to liken it to Jeopardy is not exactly correct, but it has a Jeopardy-like board. Has a grid board. Can you give the viewers a sense of how this, because it is an odd show, how it played and what the theme of the show was?
Which one?
Phew.
Oh. Well, you lost me. I thought, can you rephrase the question?
Well, give us a sense of how the game was played. It's a general interest quiz game, but it's also a comedy game.
Yes, it was a comedy game, but the comedy went so fast, you did not have time to fully enjoy it, absorb it. It was based upon catchphrases and what do you call it when you flip something? There's a name that I can't think of, and each box, when they gave an answer, would flip, and it would either be a complete reversal, it would be a humorous end. But as soon as you realized what it was, you went to the next box. I know I'm not being very articulate here, but each of those boxes and each of those questions and answers were based upon this little word that I can't think of, the unexpected answer. And it was cute and it was clever, but the only thing is you got 100 of them in 5 minutes and you didn't know what you watched. 30 minutes later, you say, "What happened?" It was too fast and too me. I should shut up. It was just too much.
Well, this is
too rich. It was a rich brew.
This is another show which has often been the case over the years that, in an attempt to save it, it was retitled the all-new Celebrity, and celebrities were brought into the series.
Same thing. The show was dying, so they threw in some more celebrities. I can say they throw in celebrities and money and girls and music and anything they can to just to keep it alive. That's all it was.
Let me ask you about just a couple of names associated with that show, important names. You mentioned one just briefly, Jay Wolpert, longtime association with game show production. What are your memories of Jay Wolpert?
Very bright guy, great sense of humor, enjoyed working with him, haven't seen him since. I know he's around doing something because he's very bright. Don't know anything about, haven't seen him since. I don't even know what the date is on that.
This was, the show ended, according to the notes, in May of 1980.
Okay. For 26 years, or no, 36 years, I don't know where I haven't seen him.
Another name, the creator of the Midnight Special, Burt Sugarman.
Yeah, I heard he was one of the angels on that show. By that I mean he had some money invested in that, and that's all I know. I never met him.
Okay, so he
Well,
never
I met
wasn't
him. We said hello. I saw him in the audience one day, or rather in the rehearsal, but I don't know him.
wasn't actively involved in the show in a
No,
hands-on way.
no.
One other name. This is your first, as best I could tell from the notes, association with Rod Roddy,
Yeah.
who was only then beginning to build his name as a game show personality and announcer. He's the announcer on. What are your memories of Rod?
Oh, he was a delight. He was a delight. He had a voice and a style that was his own. There was only one Rod Roddy, and he was all over the place. He was one of those guys, like Johnny Olsen. He could go way up there, way down there, and he just covered the scale with energy, and yet he was clean and crisp in everything he did. You could understand everything he said and did, no matter how fast he said it, and was a delight to work with. I loved him. He was, and he came out. He did a warm up like few people other than Johnny Olsen ever did. Great warm up with the audience. He used to bring in all kinds of recorded stuff and do play games with the audience and get them energized. And he was a good energizer.
Interesting you bring up warm-up. Those who are watching, who will see this video, many of whom will know that due to the AFTRA contracts in those days, the game show announcer often did the warm-up too. It's funny, you being the host and being backstage and prepping for the show, I wouldn't necessarily assume that you were aware of the warm-ups that were going on, but you mentioned Johnny's warm-up, Rod's warm-up.
Yeah.
Did you generally, over the years, as you're prepping for the show, did you hear these guys doing their warm-ups?
I was a warm-up man myself. Oh, I did warm-ups for a lot of shows, just various shows. Like, I'll never forget one time I was Sid Caesar. Sid was a big hit on Broadway. I mean, in New York, and they brought his show out to the West Coast for a show or two, and for whatever reason they hired me as the warm-up man, and I went in, and as a warm-up man, let's face it, you are a performer, boy. I mean, you're not just an announcer. You are out there to mesmerize and energize that audience and make them happy that they're where they are, and make them want to see what's coming up. So it's showtime, folks. A warm-up person. Who's the other one? Gene Wood. Oh, he was brilliant. Gene Wood would work with an audience, whether it's 10 people or 100 people or 1,000 people. He would go out there, mingle with them, play games, ad-lib with them. The ball was always in the air. And when he got through, by the time that you were going on the air, that audience was with you and excited and could hardly wait for the show to happen. That's what a warm-up, and I did a lot of that. I did an awful lot of that. I did the warm-up for Giselle McKenzie, for the Colgate Comedy Hour. Colgate Comedy Hour. Colgate Palmolive Comedy Hour. Say that one 5 times. And I did a lot of that stuff. So but warm-up is a kind of a special thing. Sometimes some shows have just a warm-up man besides the announcer. But when it came to Gene Wood and Rod Roddy and Johnny Olsen, John Harlan, they got out there. And also another guy in the early days was Jay Stewart. Great warm-up man.
Because you've mentioned warming up these shows, are these shows that you worked as an announcer on, or were you simply a warm-up man?
Usually as the announcer on also. Warm up, announce. You warm up, then go under the audience to a little booth and do the introduction of the show, whatever required, or at the break going into a commercial.
And again, if I understand correctly, in those days, the warm-up was a separate fee that was a small fee tacked on to the actual cup price for the announce, so therefore the announcer would usually do the warm-up also. Did you...
Yeah.
Was this during the days like before you got Big Game? What years were you doing this warm-up and announce? We didn't talk about that.
Back when I was doing, remember when I said I did radio in the daytime and television in the afternoon? In the afternoon, I would do commercials and warm-ups for various shows. We had shows like Peter Potter's Jukebox Jury and shows like that, a lot of little shows, little panel shows, and I would go and do warm-ups for those shows.
Couple of final shows here that you worked on after going into the early 1980s now, and some of your final shows. Again, the next show is one of the big ones in many people's minds, and that's your hosting of Password Plus. This is noteworthy in a couple of senses. One is that, again, as you did before with Hal March, you're coming in to replace a host who's ailing and who eventually passed away, Alan Ludden. And it's also noteworthy because, as best I could find in the notes, it's the first time you ever worked for Goodson Todman, which in many people's minds is the sort of the A-list house of game show production. What do you remember about getting the gig on Password Plus?
Alan asked for me. He was seriously ill. I didn't. Incidentally, when they called me, Alan didn't do it directly. He had Jerry Chester do it, but Alan became seriously ill. I didn't know how seriously. I thought he was just ill and was going to be back. And I got this call from Jerry Chester, and he says, "Alan's ill. Would you consider coming in?" I said, "Are you kidding?" I said, "Good Lord, I'd do anything for either Alan Ludden or this show, because it's nothing but yes." The answer is yes. Where do you want me, and when do you want me? And so I came and I did the show. I thought Alan was going to recuperate. I had no idea the extent of his problem. It turns out it was terminal. If he knew it was terminal, he didn't say so. But that's typical of Alan. He wouldn't do that. He was always optimistic. And he and Betty both were right to the end, living each day as if it's the best day of their lives. That's the way they were. Alan, you know something? They would have used, and they did earlier, Bill Cullen used to spell Alan on Password once in a while for whatever reason. And I think, no one's ever said this to me, but I think they would have used Alan the time they called me, but Bill was busy doing, I think, blockbusters at the time. And so since he was doing blockbusters, I think Alan said, "Well, call my buddy." That would be me. And they did, and it was such a privilege to do that show. It was a great show. I loved it. And of course, I was very, very close to Alan. Alan and Betty, unfortunately, are two good friends.
One of the things that you did at the end of each of those shows is you would say, "Alan, we're thinking about you. We hope you get well." And even Betty White came on the show as a celebrity player a number of times, more than perhaps she might have otherwise, and would talk about, Alan, we hope he gets well. How far into that run did you get a sense that he wasn't coming back?
I can't remember when it was finally said to me that it was said to be like this: "Alan won't be back, you know. And I said, "Oh," and I can't remember who said that to me, but that's the way they handled it. And I can't remember when it happened, but it wasn't at the outset. I only did it for a couple of years. What was that, a year and a half?
Well, it shows here October 80 to March 82.
Okay, year and a half or 2 years. I can't remember how far into it was when I got the word, but I finally got the word. And when it comes to saying, "Thinking of you, Alan," or something like, I didn't do it nearly enough. I've watched Game Show Network since then, and I've seen it, and I've watched it, and I've said it to myself, "Well, you should have said something about Alan," because Alan Ludden was Password, and Password was Alan Ludden. So he could not have been mentioned enough. It was his show. I was simply there. And of course, well, anyway, so Betty and I would say, and he was naturally watching the show while I did it. And anyway, we were just trying to keep touch with him while he was on his journey. And he finally went, unfortunately. That was so sad. Here he was at the peak of his career and going strong. And what a guy. Whew. I said a while ago Cullen was the best. Well, he was. I'm not going to modify that. But also, Alan Ludden, at what he did, he was the best. He was Class A.
there was a certain charm and almost sophistication to Ludden's presentation
Yeah.
that a lot of hosts don't have. He had a certain
Yeah,
polish.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He was. Yeah. He was a Phi Beta Kappa, and it showed. Yeah. He was classy.
I mentioned a moment ago, this is your first time working for Goodson Todman. Again, a lot of game show fans and people who were in the business really venerated that production company as maybe the best of the best. Why had you never worked for them previously, and what were your thoughts working for them?
Well, Mark Goodson had to get over the fact that he hated me. I'll remind you, I did a thing called You Don't Say, which went on opposite, or at least the same time as Password, and Mark Goodson hated me with a passion. No one's ever said that, but I'm saying it now. He couldn't stand anything to do with You Don't Say. And so I would be the least guy he would want to hire until the years peeled off and he finally got over it and saw me doing other things, and we eventually became friends. As far as I'm concerned, we were always friends, but all I'm saying is he wouldn't have hired me if you paid him $1 million. But when we finally did get together, we got along quite well.
Did you have, in those days, I don't know, their company evolved over the years. Was Bill Todman much involved in those days? And
Never met Bill Todman. Never met him.
So when you first came on to Password Plus, you're saying at that time, if Goodson had had his druthers, as they say, he would have preferred you not be the host at that time, and that evolved and changed as you worked the show. Is that a fair way to assess it?
Yeah, I think so. Say it again. I'm sorry.
That Goodson's animosity toward you faded away while you were working on Password Plus, and he became to respect you as a host.
I think it. When did Body Language come on?
Well,
I've got notes too.
That's
Body
1984. Language. That's your second Goodson Todman show.
Oh, that was after Password Plus.
Yeah.
There was something else I did before Password Plus, and I can't remember what it was. It's coming back a little bit. Mark Goodson and company was working over a new format for a new show, and they asked me to come in to help them with the run-through. They did that often, people like me and Pat Sajak and Alex Trebek, they would bring us in and have us sit in for contestants. And I went in to a few of those for Mark Goodson to help his company work a show. Mark Goodson observed me during that time, evidently liked what he saw. So he began to, I think, form an appreciation for me that he hadn't had before. He always thought of me as that other guy, that other announcer who got in the way for a while, and realized that I was really more than that, and he saw what I contributed, to his run-throughs, and so he changed 360, and we became friends. And so by the time Password Plus came along and Body Language, it was like, hey, Tom, he would write me notes. He didn't write many notes. Well, he would write notes, but I mean, he would write complimentary notes. He didn't do that very often. He would write me complimentary notes, uncalled for. I mean, no one solicited. A girl would come in my room and say, "This is from Mr. Goodson," and I'd read it, and he would compliment me on what I had just done. To me, that was a big thing. And it tells you that genuinely, when things settled down, we were friends.
Well, as we said, after coming on with Goodson Todman, you did a couple of Goodson Todman shows, and the next one you just mentioned was Body Language, 1984 to 1986.
Yeah.
A fun show where you a lot of great celebrity guests, Johnny Olson as the announcer.
Yeah.
A show that you said, and we were talking off camera, you said you enjoyed hosting. Talk about Body Language.
Well, it was an old format. Show Me it has been seen in any number of different Show Me is one of them with Bobby Van. And in other words, it was charades, it was going back, it would have, in the early days of television, it was called Celebrity Charades. There's a name for it. And where you pantomime clues to people, places, and things. And that's what body language was. Only to make it worthy of bringing back on the air, they attached a game to it with a phrase, and each time you successfully conveyed a clue, it would go up in the phrase, and you had to guess what the phrase was. So, in other words, that phrase was tacked onto it like a wasp nest. You just slapped it on there, and they gave it it was a game within a game. They did a game of charades, and then attached to it was this phrase solving game, and it was okay. Once again, it was a bit too much. I think it was, in other words, the game itself, the pantomime part of it was a game in itself, as far as I'm concerned. The fact that they put that other game onto it was okay, but all it did was just muddy the waters just a little bit. What was that first one? Pantomime Quiz. These are all shows that were like Pantomime. Pantomime Quiz was the first. Pantomime Quiz is charades, period. And then, so this was a game of charades with a game, with another game attached to it. And I enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. It was okay.
This may be an unusual observation. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but one of the things that strikes me about your performance on that show versus most of your others, or maybe all the others, is it's not a typical set in the sense you're not standing at a lectern, you're not stationary, you're hosting the show out in full view of the audience.
Yeah, right.
The shots largely are taken your full body. Is there any added challenge to hosting that way?
The only challenge is to try to stay out of the camera angles. You had to know where you could go and where you couldn't go. And so I had certain marks I had to hit, or at least for the most part. And in other words, I had to appear at some point, and I also had to disappear at another point. Once I I go to here, I'd bring the celebrity down. The contestant would stay right where, I'd bring the celebrity down, take the celebrity over to the podium, talk to the contestant, bring the contestant into the pit where they did the act, and then get the hell out while they did their thing, and then come back in. So I was mobile more than I was on most shows for those reasons. I know that sounds silly, but that's what it was. I had certain places I had to be, and I had certain places where I had to stay out of the shot. And so that's what that was all about.
You mentioned him briefly a moment ago, but I'll ask you about him specifically. The announcer on Body Language is Johnny Olson.
Yeah.
One of the more revered, if not most revered, of the game show announcers of that era, and maybe the most respected of the Goodson-Todman announcers. You mentioned his warm-up. What are your thoughts on working with Johnny Olson?
Absolutely. I looked for it when I did the nighttime Price is Right. And one of the thrills was not just doing the Price is Right. It was the first time I'd worked with Johnny. I had crossed paths with him on other shows as a walk-on, but it was the first time I really worked with him, and I was as excited about working with him as I was working the show. That'll tell you how much I thought of him. Oh, he was golden. I just loved him. And he brought me in as if I had been there all my life. Hey, Tommy K, how you doing? He was a terrific guy.
Well, you mentioned Nighttime Price. 1985 to 86, you hosted a syndicated nighttime version of Price is Right, 170 episodes. Here's a series, obviously long history in broadcasting, and in the modern sense of the new Price is Right, Bob Barker had already been hosting it over 10 years by that time. Dennis James had done it.
Well, yeah.
What were your thoughts on coming in to do a nighttime version of a show that was so strongly identified with a particular host?
Oh, well, I was lucky to do it, and I was thrilled to do it. And the show belonged to Bob Barker. What Bob Barker did with that show for, you said, I think he's about totaled out 30 years. 35 years.
At that time, he had done 12
that's phenomenal.
years,
yeah, but even at that time, the only reason he didn't do it, I'm trying to remember, I guess he's just too damn busy to do them all. And so they threw little crumbs like that to me. Dennis James did it one year too. So getting back to the show, I enjoyed doing it. I never owned the show.
In the metaphorical sense of the term.
I never owned it. I got in there and I did it, but poorly, haltingly, as far as I'm concerned. Got by with it. It's okay, but I was nowhere near what Barker did with that show. Barker was a genius. The shows that he had up here, in excess of 75 shows. I don't know how many he had really. They brought me in to do 1 year's worth, and they introduced me to about 35 shows. And they had to work with me, and they give me little formats for each little game that's played. I guess I'm not making myself clear. Within a show, you have to do 2 or 3 games, and you have to know each game, the rules for each one, and the marks to hit. Hit a mark, take them here, and you have to do that. So you have to be chewing gum and walking at the same time, or patting your head, whatever the expression is. And I had a very difficult time. As I said earlier, I'm a very slow starter. And I would go over those shows, these little individual games, time after time. And I got by with them, but I was never as smooth, as flawless as Barker was. Never. Didn't even come close.
Now, one of the keys, and of course we have Randy here who also worked on Price during the Bob Barker years. One of the keys to this game, as everyone has seen it many times, is that it's different every day. It's not the same. It's never
Which
the
one,
same.
Price?
Price is Right. So it's not just knowing all these games, but the fact that there's a different lineup of games every time you tape it.
Well, they're a different lineup, but they're the same games. You just shuffle them up.
Well, but there's a large number of
Well,
games.
that's
to
what
be
I said.
shuffled. Yeah.
Remember I did this?
Yeah.
He had up in his cranium, he's a very bright guy and a great memory. That was one of the first things that impressed me about Bob Barker when I first became aware of him, was the job he did on Truth or Consequences back in the 50s. He was one of the few MCs who came out, and you talk about not knowing what's going to happen. Truth or Consequences was a real hullabaloo, Hezbollah, what do you call it, a hell's a poppin' kind of a show. Things would happen in pop, and they did different things. He would come on that show, no cue cards, no nothing. He would be introduced to a lady up in the audience, and at the tail end of the show, he would go back and nail her again. He would remember her name. He had it here, and he had a memory, and he was brilliant at it. And so when that same quality and those same abilities that I'm talking about, he carried through all his career, and he just fit, or rather Price fit him to a T. He remembered every game, and never used a cue card. Well, he probably used cue cards at the outset, but as soon as I use the term owned. As soon as he owned a show, there were no more cue cards. All you had to do is say the Barker bingo or lingo, or whatever. What was the thing? Plinko, and he would say okay, or they had the staff would have a key word for every game that was played, a word or two. They'd say to Barker such as that, and he would do it. He would just stand there and say, bring up the next contestant, and go right into it. Go into commercial, come back, they give him another one, he'd go right into that. And he would go into each game. There were 4 or 5 games, I guess, in each game, in every show. And he did it as if they had rehearsed all day.
Because it is such an important show and because it is a challenge to host, can you give us a sense of your memories of a production day of doing that show when you were doing it? Did you do more than one a day?
Yeah, we did more than one a day.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did you do...
I think we did 2 a day.
How far in advance of the taping did you get the rundown of the games?
Oh, a week in advance.
Yeah.
Frank Wayne was the producer at that time, executive producer, and he would say, I don't want to give you too much because, you can only go. So here's next week's shows. Like we would do a couple of shows the next week. He would hand me a list of the games that were going to be played. And then he had already given me a little dossier of each game. And I would come home and go through those little games, and I'd write myself cards. And it was a very difficult show to do, I thought. And I never did. I've already said that. So anyway.
So many notable personalities associated with Price. Are there any people on the production staff you think we should mention from that
Well,
time?
Frank Wayne was brilliant. Was Jay Wilford still on staff? 'Cause
No, no.
He had started.
Jay Dobkowitz, what's his first
Roger
name?
Dobkowitz.
Roger Dobkowitz was on the floor. Frank was the exec.
Was Frank's son there at the time, Philip?
Yeah,
Yeah.
he was there. I don't know what his. He was. Let it go. He was an associate producer type. He did a lot of stuff. I don't know what his title was, but he was there. But the girls were very welcoming. They welcomed me aboard. Not just the models, Janice and I can't even think of their names right now. I'm sorry, no offense, but the girls on the staff who did all the work and put all the materials together, did everything they could to make me feel at home.
Kathy Greco.
Yeah, right. Kathy was a terrific.
Barbara Hunter, maybe at that time or later.
No, she was later. I met Barbara, but she was not one of them. The Paris.
Cheryl
Paris was one of them.
One of the Paris sisters.
Yeah, that's right, one of the Paris sisters. I started to say the Paris sisters, but it's Cheryl Paris. They were great for me. They were the ones that brought me in. I mean, anytime I had a question, I'd go to them because they had been with the show from the very beginning. So they made me feel very welcome, and they armed me as much as they could with what I needed.
Anything else on Price? Again, coming to the end of your produced shows, there are a couple of unproduced pilots unsold pilots I'd like to ask you about. But the last of the shows for NBC is Wordplay, 1987. And here's a show that runs from December of 86 to September of 87. Again, another word association, kind of a word association game, also kind of a humorous celebrity bluffing sort of game. Tell us about Wordplay.
Well, it had been around forever. That's another format that had been around for decades. And a good format. That's why it keeps coming back. That was a good show. I enjoyed it. They had to try to find a way of making it interesting because it was on before called Take My Word. And I remember one time somebody was doing it up and they were syndicating it out of San Francisco, and I went up there and did it as a celebrity. I can't remember what they called it. I guess that was Take My Word. Oh, you know who it was? Jim Lang was doing it. Anyway, it was the same show, basically the same format, but body language, very well done. They used that. You know, a lot of it was only usable, if that's the word, through electronics. They could do things with electronics in that year that they couldn't do 20 years ago. Everything was on cards or on they pull a card or turn something around. But at this thing, they would magically put up words, and so that was a cute thing that they did. I enjoyed it. That's about all I can say. It was a good show, and we had a nice run. That's it.
Now, you have expressed that, in other venues, you've expressed that at this period of time, some of the shows you were working on didn't sell, and at that point you decided for whatever reason maybe it was time to retire or consider retiring. What are your thoughts on that general time in the late 80s when you decided, enough of a career and, as you said to us earlier off camera, retire at the beach?
I didn't retire. The phone stopped ringing. That's all. I didn't retire from anything. It's just the phone. I told Betty one day, I said, I'm going to have to call the phone company. Something's wrong with this phone. It's not ringing anymore. And that's when I knew I was retired. No, I had no intention of retiring. I tried and fairly successfully creating a product or two of my own to keep from going bats. And but I was ready to go. No, I didn't retire. I never said to anyone, I retire. The industry retired me.
We all know about demographic shifts and all those things, and they were becoming especially strong in the early 90s, I think, all that demographic stuff in television. Do you have any sense of what changed around that time that the phone stopped ringing?
No.
Atmosphere at the networks?
I got older and the shows got younger, yeah. It's that simple, yeah.
One last thing. Were you about to say something?
Namely, the shows got younger.
Yeah.
It's true I got older, but it didn't slow me down that much. But they started changing. They got a lot younger with a lot more with a lot of different material that I was not necessarily at home with. Yeah.
One of the shows that you worked on during that time from your own production company in conjunction with Carol Burnett is a show called Star Play, a co-production, I guess, between your company and hers.
Yeah.
And you did a run-through and also taped a formal pilot of this, and I guess it didn't sell. Tell us about Star Play.
It's a good show. I still like it. It is a blend, once again, a spin-off of any number of shows. It's a spin-off of Password. It's a spin-off of Charades. Those two. In other words, they act out clues. They go up on a board, and then the board is part of a phrase. Those things, if they sound familiar, they should, because they're existent in other shows. They were a little piece of this and a little piece of that. So that's all I did. I took 2 or 3 shows, namely charades and placing and words, and words and phrases and charades, and I put them together in a thing called Star Play, and it worked. It really was a cute show. It didn't sell because that year that they went to the marketplace where they used to sell game shows that were all talk shows. Those were the days of Oprah Winfrey, Phil Donahue, et cetera, and Roseanne Barr. The talk shows just took over, and so a show like mine was no longer in demand. Everybody that looked at it honestly said, "It's a cute show, Tom. Can't use it, but it's cute."
How did you become?
Thanks for coming in. Have a good day.
How did you become involved with Carol Burnett?
I went after her. Burt Reynolds went after Burt. Burt Gonvey had a show, which was another spinoff, and he went after Burt Reynolds. And Burt Reynolds helped him get that show on the air. So I said, "Oh, really? Okay, I have a show. I'm going to go after Carol Burnett. Go for the top." And I did. And it took a while, but I finally brought her in to my way of thinking, and we joined forces and put it together. I was proud of the fact that I was working with that woman. There's one of the most talented people ever, Carol Burnett. Oh, it was a pleasure working with her.
Well, in concluding our chat, because that's the last of your formal credits, there are a couple of shows I'd like to ask you about that were pilots you hosted that didn't sell.
Okay.
And see if you have any memories of these shows. We talked about the Golden Triangle.
Yeah.
Another show, I could only find a passing reference to it. I couldn't find anything about it, really, even a date, is a show called Higher, Lower. Do you recall this show?
Yeah, I do. And that's it's in Price is Right. There's a high-low game in Price is Right. That's what this was. This was a show based upon higher, lower. And you had to keep guessing until you got the price or whatever it was within a certain range. I can't reiterate it now, but that's all it was. But it was a cute show. I liked it. It was a simple thing because it was one of the shows. Price is Right is made up of a number of shows that are shows in themselves if they're handled properly and showcased properly, and that was one of them. It was a good show. I remember when we did it, I came home, I told Betty, I said, I really liked that one. I was doing more than a few pilots in those days. The phone was ringing in those days.
Because I don't have it in the notes, what year was that? Do you recall, or what years, more or less?
Recall.
And do you recall?
I have no idea.
Do you recall who the production company was?
No.
Okay. It's okay. And one last one, 1988, Wink Martindale produced Eavesdroppers.
Mm-hmm. It was all right. It was a cute pilot. That's about all I can say. It was Wink worked very hard on it, and he produced the heck out of it. He did a great job. He and his company, but it didn't sell. But it was just one of those pilots that we did and didn't stick to the wall, as they say.
Any reason why, despite his long association as a host, that he chose you to host it and not host it himself? Or do you know why?
I can't remember. He's probably doing another show at the time.
I think that basically concludes my notes. Randy, before we go, you have
Yeah.
such a history. Do you have any questions you'd like to ask? But anything
This is Randy
related to-
West we're talking about.
That's right.
Just some more recollections of
Yeah.
great iconic people. Paul Alter,
Yeah.
Mark Breslow.
Well, I knew him, but I didn't know him well because I did body language with Paul Alter, and I did Price is Right with Breslow, and I got along fine with them. But they were part of the Goodson group, and
How about the Byers? Mike Brockman, Barbara Hunter.
I never got to know Barbara very well. We only met tangentially, if that's the word, and Mike a number of times. I first met Mike when he was with ABC. Why, I don't know, but he was doing something over at ABC. I guess when I was doing Split Second.
He was doing Feud. Might have been a buyer at ABC. Yes, he was. Came in under Silverman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I crossed paths with him there. Then he went over to CBS, and I presented a show or two to him, and he never did a very good job because he didn't buy my shows.
There you go.
Too bad. He's a
Freddie
nice
Sil-
man.
Yeah, Freddie Silverman, and the other one is.
I
Brian
never knew
Franz.
Freddie Silverman. I only knew of him. I met him, but that's all.
Brian Franz, he was the buyer.
I remember Brian Franz. Brian Franz was there, I believe. I don't know. That was at NBC. I met Brian Franz. We never worked together. I remember pitching a show to Brian Franz. As a matter of fact, I remember Brian Franz sitting there and said, "This is the first time I've had a game show MC pitch a show to me." Yeah, really. And I said, "Oh, how about that?"
Two last things. One, because we're here as a part of our Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters archives. What was your first awareness of the Pioneer Broadcasters? You were a founding member. You said being formed.
I was.
You're a past president. What are your thoughts on the formation of this group and its role in your life?
I think it's a great group. I've loved it every minute since 1966. And all the people, beginning with Art Gilmore, Ralph Edwards, John Harlan, many others, too numerous to mention, all good friends, all good colleagues, all professional people, and all of them that made you proud to be part of the profession. It's really a profession. It's not, it's not just one show that they did or one position they held. It was that they all were very active in a thing called broadcasting. And of course, Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters is more than just a broadcasting thing now. I'm still associated with it, so I'll use the word we. I'll use the editorial word. And we still bring in people from movies. In other words, if you're talented, no matter what your talent is, it doesn't have to be a microphone. It doesn't have to be a camera. It can be a sheet of paper. It can be a writer. It can be a producer, a director, a singer, a dancer. It doesn't matter. People from all walks of show business. And I love it. I think it's a great outfit, and I enjoy it to this day.
In closing, is there anything you'd like to tell us about which I have not asked you?
No, I can't think of anything. When I meet with people like you and I have an interview, the things that come screaming back to me are the basic things. For instance, without my wife, it would never have happened. She was as Vin Scully said the other day in saying goodbye, she was the wind under my wings. She was a producer who had 4 kids. She was a great wife. She was a great mother. And she supported me all along the line. Without her, it wouldn't have happened. Next to her, my brother helped me get into the industry. Once I got into the industry, I met people, iconic people like Betty White, Bill Cullen, Alan Ludden, Carol Burnett, and all the rest of it is just simply icing on the cake. I have enjoyed, as I said during one line early on, when I went to work on whatever the first show was, I never worked another day in my life. Once I got on the air, whether it would be radio or television, I was home free. I was doing what I wanted to do, and that that's a true blessing. That's it.
Well, Tom Kennedy, we're truly honored to have come into your home. Thank you for inviting us and for the opportunity to chat about your history.
You're welcome. My pleasure.